Recording this. Welcome everyone to this is the first event for the year for the Modal Learning Hub. And if you'd like to hear more details about the upcoming talks, feel free to send me an email and I'll add you to the mailing list. And our speaker for today is Professor Bob Sainburg from Penn State. And I met Bob when I was doing my postdoc at Penn State quite a few years ago now. Which I guess during that period, maybe you could call it the golden age of motor control at Penn State. There was a huge number of motor control researchers, and there were tons and tons of students, and there were always great conversations around everywhere. And I learned a lot while I was there, and also learned a lot from Bob and about topics related to laterality of the hands in motor control research. And so Bob started his studies. He has an undergraduate degree in occupational therapy from NYU and a master's and a PhD from Rutgers University. He did a postdoc at Columbia, and after a position at the State University of New York in Buffalo, he's been at Penn State since 2000. And what's unique about Bob is he has two labs, one at the main Penn State campus in State College, and another one at the where the medical campus is in Hershey in the neurology department. So he combines together more basic motor control research with more applied research, which I think we'll be talking about today. And I guess he's most well known, or at least what I explain most to my students about, is for his studies in lateralization, about the dynamic dominance model, and which I've often explained to students that it's not that we have necessarily a right hand is better than the left hand, rather the hands have different are good at doing different things, and if you look at more detailed level, it's more to do with the different roles of different side of the brain. But I'm sure he'll talk more about that today. So I'm very happy you accepted the invitation and interested to hear about your talk today. So thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, here is home for me, but it's a pleasure to be speaking with you guys. Wish I could be there. By the way, this figure here is from this little animation is from British claymation series Wallace and Gromit, which we played for my kids when they were young. My oldest is now 35, so it was pretty long ago. But what always struck me about what we ended up doing with stroke patients is that we, as you'll see, we've focused on the good arm in stroke. And my friends like Jules DeWald at Northwestern University, who studies the bad arm in stroke, used to yell at me, "It's the wrong arm, Bob. You got to study the other one." And so it always reminded me of this movie called The Wrong Trousers by Wallace and Gromit, which is why I show this. But as Jason said, I do translational work. I'm going to talk about our model of motor lateralization. And I want to say now, like anywhere along the way, please stop me if you have a question, because I think waiting till the end makes it very difficult for everybody, and other people have the same questions, and it'll just help things go along. I'm not really worried about getting through any particular set of data today. I'm going to be describing this story from what I think of as more basic motor lateralization to stroke. And I have to say, I'm always struck by, so as Jason said, we have this model of motor lateralization called dynamic dominance, which actually a colleague who Jason, I think, knows pretty well, David Rosenbaum. He is in was in psychology in our department. Now he's in California. But he was really encouraging me to name this thing very early on. And so I named it. But I think it was a mistake, because when you name something, people think of it more like a theory or something that's very set. And I have to say, to this day, I have no idea I shouldn't say no idea, but I'm very open to what these things are that are lateralized. I'm pretty sure that the two sides of the brain are to some degree dealing with different aspects of control, and I'll show you the evidence. But whether these things are what we say they are, because we're measuring dependent variables in movement, I don't know. And I kind of doubt we're right. And I kind of doubt it's this simple. But you have to describe things when you're when you're doing research. So I'm going to tell you a story that makes a lot of sense to us and has been useful in translating to the clinic. So starting out with the translational part of it, when somebody has a stroke and it's a middle cerebral artery stroke that affects their sensory motor cortices and the fibers of passage from there, they tend to have what's shown here as the effects of paresis. This would probably be pretty strong paresis, and there tends to be a flexor synergy. There tends to be abnormal muscle tone, and limits in voluntary movement that can be severe. And what we do in physical rehabilitation is we tend to focus on trying to remediate that. I don't know if any of you work with neurological disorders and stroke, but no matter how much neuroscientists talk about neuroplasticity, when you damage the nervous system, it's very resistant to positive change in function. So whether or not there's, plasticity, changes in response to that damage or in response to training and stroke, it's been very frustrating because at best you get incremental changes. In the early stages, you can get pretty large changes, but that's with or without therapy. So it all depends on your degree of damage. Rehab tends to focus on remediating this limb and then looks at the other limb, which is always thought to be unaffected in terms of compensation. If the bad limb is unable to do something, use the other limb. And so therapy isn't focused on doing anything with this limb in terms of remediating, which means getting better function with that limb. And I'm gonna describe to you why maybe that's not a great idea. Now, as long as I'm saying this, of course, rehab is focused on function, the whole body, the whole person. But I'm just talking about the physical elements of rehabilitation that address limbs. So I want to throw out right now, what if the contralesional or bad arm can't perform manipulations? You have severe paresis. So all of these things called activities of daily living, basically taking care of yourself. Is there a question? Okay. Basically taking care of yourself every day. If you can't open and close your hand functionally, then the ipsilesional or the good arm has to do everything. And what I want to impress upon you is if you lost one of your arms, whether it's dominant or non-dominant, you'd have to do everything with the other arm unilaterally. And so that arm would not only have to function, but it would have to function as sort of a super controller. So imagine, putting your clothes on, doing your, showering, getting dressed with only one arm. So the functioning of the ipsilesional arm becomes, amplified by having a dysfunctional arm. So you'll see our approach is going to be testing and remediating both limbs when it's appropriate, not all the time. So I'm going to describe this translational story from the basic science of motor lateralization to implications for motor function and stroke to clinical intervention. And you'll see basically what happened was I was studying motor lateralization. I didn't want to, but I was studying something else and I had this asymmetry and it was really frustrating me. My wife said to me, what are you, an idiot? You're an occupational therapist. It's called handedness. Why don't you study it? And my response was, I don't want to study handedness. And I ended up taking her advice as usual and studying it. And it was really interesting. Then we used stroke patients as guinea pigs to kind of test our model. But the thing is that what we found was that these patients had problems with their good arm that we realized it was imperative to figure out whether we could remediate, because they were functionally limiting, as I'll describe. So, lateralization, if any of you know, I'm sorry, Yuri, is it that late? So you yawned. That was just a joke. It wasn't a good joke. All right, so lateralization of the brain is something that's really ubiquitous throughout the animal kingdom. And for a long time, people thought of it as a uniquely human trait. And I think the reason was because it became very obvious to people in neuroscience when observing people who had temporal lobe lesions and end up with aphasias. So, if your left temporal lobe is lesioned, you can have aphasia, which is a loss of language, which is a very frustrating thing. Turns out that if your right temporal lobe is lesioned, then you have other problems with language, but not lexicon and syntax. So people started to think, okay, so maybe lateralization is something that happened, as higher functions occurred in humans and maybe even non-human primates. Turns out that these guys, McNeil, Edge, Rogers, Valor-Tegera, have shown that lateralization of the nervous system occurred, basically 500 million years ago with the advent of animals, vertebrates. Rogers is, I think, retired now, but she's still exploring the idea that lateralization also occurs in invertebrate species. So, what is lateralization? It's kind of a functional division where one side of the nervous system does things differently than the other side of the nervous system. And in especially mammals, non-human primates, humans, where does it occur? It occurs in all of our tertiary processing areas. It's not that surprising if you were engineering a brain and I said, do some function, some higher level function, and you don't have to attach to the periphery. You can get that information from the other areas of the brain that still have it. You wouldn't duplicate that function in the two sides of the brain. And you also wouldn't have a computational process that relies on these really long connections between analogous regions of the brain for that computation. You'd rely on that for output. So if you wanted to conserve energy, which seems to be an important thing in evolution, then what you would do is you would make the smallest possible circuit that could do all its computations internally and then send the stuff out. And that's apparently how we've evolved. So lateralization is kind of an organizational principle of the nervous system and not an odd thing that occurred later in evolution. So these guys came up with the idea, as we do in science, we try and simplify everything. And that's what I'm telling you about what I've done with this, stupid model that I have. So in simplifying all of these findings throughout the animal kingdom, they said that one hemisphere, and they often say left, although it's not always the left, deals with ordinary and familiar circumstances, and the other hemisphere deals with unexpected circumstances. And this doesn't mean open loop and closed loop control. It really means dealing with expected, predictable stuff and dealing with unpredictable stuff. And this can be, in this case, prey-predator behavior, emotional behavior, visual processing. But in our case, we're talking about motor lateralization in humans. Most of the studies that I'm going to show you are done on this system that I developed many, many years ago, where people start at a point and they move to a point. Sometimes, bilateral movements, sometimes other games are involved, and I'll describe them. But, for the most part, you can see the center outreaching task. It's pretty boring, but as you know, in science, the more that one paradigm is studied, the more background you have to learn from it. And that's what we've exploited. So the very early stuff that we did, this is the data that I got that I tried to get the two hands to behave the same. And we had people moving on this system. By the way, a lot of the data that I'm going to show you has an air sled under the hand. So we make lots and lots of movements without friction. That also gives us the ability to easily specify the dynamics of movements, which is sometimes our goal. In this case, you can see the left and the right hand movements. When we ask people to move really fast to a target without visual feedback, There are systematic differences in what the dominant arm does and the non-dominant arm. For almost all the studies I'm going to show you, we're dealing with right-handers. There's a reason for this. Left-handers not only are a small proportion of the population, but left-handers also don't look like they are either neurophysiologically, neurologically, or behaviorally the opposite of right-handers. So our approach was to figure out what's going on with right-handedness and then see if it extends to left-handedness. So this is right-hander. The left arm tends to move in this kind of characteristic curvy linear way. If you were to watch somebody do this, or if you were to do this and feel it, you wouldn't notice any differences. And these are really small differences in terms of curvature, as you can see. But what we find is that we look at the inverse dynamics. You can see here, this is what we call the muscle torque, which is the residual torque, when you take everything that's due to the dynamics of the environment and the limb away. So it's due to, you could also call it the input torque at a joint. It's the stuff that muscles are doing, that non-contractile tissues are doing. And for the range and movements that we're dealing with, it's mostly muscle activations. And you can see here the non-dominant arm uses at the elbow joint here a lot more muscle torque than the dominant arm. The dominant arm is taking advantage, if you will, of its own intrinsic inertial dynamics. In this case, it's inertial dynamics. Those other dynamics, you go out to the fingers, you go out to the wrist, and you're dealing more with viscoelastic dynamics. And as we've seen in recent studies of ours, same thing occurs there. The dominant system seems to be able to take advantage of these dynamics. If we look at energetic efficiency in terms of torque impulse, we've also calculated work. We've also calculated power in different studies. The dominant arm seems to be able to do roughly the same thing, a little different kinematically with a lot more energetic efficiency. If we look at, so right here, I have the hand paths plotted in a right-hand coordinate system, just for comparison. The left hand tends to, is in black here, tends to move out laterally, whereas the right hand tends to move in medially. And I'm sorry, the left is in blue. I was using my left hand there. Left tends to move out laterally. And if you think about this movement, if I extend my elbow and then I accelerate my shoulder, I have more inertia to deal with, so I need more torque. If I pull my elbow in as I move, then I can reduce inertia and I can make a more efficient movement. But the important thing about this is that if we look at the hand path curvature, a measure of curvature, direction change between the initiation of movement, peak velocity, and then peak velocity and the movement, and we plot that against interaction torque impulse, which are these inertial interactions between the segments, the right arm has the same interaction torques, but it's able to make whatever curvature it wants, regardless of them, whereas the left hand is enslaved to these interactions, which is basically why if I gave you chalk, marker, and had you walk up to a whiteboard and draw a quick circle, your dominant would draw a nice circle, really fairly good, and your non-dominant would draw an oval because it wasn't accounting for these intersegmental dynamics. And studies have been done that have demonstrated that quantitatively by Stefan Swinen and his colleagues. So we came to the conclusion that maybe dominant arm control might be specialized for optimal control of dynamics, whatever that means. I mean, you know, the body and the world and taking advantage of them. And we're picturing objective function and optimization. That's got terms in it that I'll describe later. But obviously, when we do try to minimize stuff, when we plan movements, you know, the terms of our objective function vary with our goals. So what is the non-dominant hand? Well, one of the things that's kind of wild, and a lot of people have shown this, which is strange, if you move under unpredictable circumstances, so in this case, lots and lots of targets, so you don't repeat a target, and you move with no visual feedback, then you actually tend to be more accurate in terms of the final position with the non-dominant arm. Now, you don't feel that you're more accurate, which is an interesting phenomena, but you are. And this has been demonstrated by us in a number of circumstances and by other labs. And Brooke Dexheimer, very talented PhD student who's now a professor at Virginia Commonwealth, we looked at this and we wanted to see if this has to do with predictability. So we repeated the random sequence of targets in multiple repetitions. And what we found was very early when things are unpredictable, which means you haven't moved to that target before, the right arm is worse than the left arm. And this is normalized final position. It's normalized to peak velocity. So we take account of speed accuracy relationships. The right arm is worse than the left arm in the first go round with all of these targets. But as you get more and more experience, there's a kind of crossing where the right arm or dominant arm becomes better, or at least the same as the left arm in final accuracy. So this has to do with the predictability of the things that we're looking at. So according to our hypothesis of lateralization, the non-dominant arm should perform better under unpredictable conditions, just like Velaturgia and Rogers described for other species, and the dominant arm under predictable conditions. So Vivek Yadav, who's now at Google making lots of money, was a brilliant postdoc of mine a bunch of years ago. I don't know, was Vivek here when you were here, Jason? I don't think so. Yeah, he's really a brilliant guy. He was great to work with. And so we used a robot to impose an inconsistent field, which means between trials, your field would be bigger or smaller in a sort of pseudo-randomized way, or a consistent field where you'd always experience the same field. And the thing about these fields is they're typical curl fields like other people. I think Reza Shadmir and Sandra Musaval, they introduced this idea of having this almost fake Coriolis force where you move to a target and you got pushed lateral to movement. In this case, we always pushed lateral to the direct target direction so that it wasn't a curl field, but it was a lateral field or a perpendicular field to the target direction. A curl field is called a curl field because it changes with your own direction. It can become a positive feedback system that makes you kind of curl around if you don't do a good job of compensating it, or at least that's why I think it's called a curl field. So we have this inconsistent field and this consistent field. And the unique thing about this study is we expected that the left hand would actually deal better with the inconsistent field and worse with the consistent field, and would get the exact opposite with the right arm, which would deal better with the consistent field and worse with the inconsistent field. So again, what we're trying to do is figure out, if our view of linearization is the non-dominant hemisphere limb system should be better at something. It shouldn't just be worse at everything. And so that's exactly what we found. Linearity deviation is on the y-axis here. Minimum squared jerk to things that are sometimes used to quantify the ability to compensate this field. People also use perpendicular error, which is a lot like linearity deviation here. So you can see that in the consistent field, the non-dominant arm does a lot worse than the dominant arm in terms of error. These are chunks of trials that are probably about 16 in each one. I don't really remember right now. Here's baseline performance. Low is error. Up is error and low is accurate. And what you can see here in the inconsistent field is that the dominant arm actually does substantially worse than the non-dominant arm. So we got what we were expecting there, which was kind of cool, that we could present an unpredictable circumstance and the non-dominant arm actually does better. This is something that's been sort of repeated by a few other labs, including, I'm blanking on it now. It's also been contested by a few labs. So I thought we had pretty strong results here. And as you'll see, they're pretty consistent with our future findings.
Can I ask you, sorry, I just interrupt this point for a moment.
Yeah.
When you say dominant, non-dominant, so when you say dominant, you always mean right hand for the I mean, you talked before.
Yeah, like I said before, we're dealing with right dominant people here. And like I said before, left dominance is something that we haven't dealt with much, but we have a little bit. The problem with left dominance is that it's neurophysiologically and behaviorally heterogeneous. So you have this broad spectrum of individuals who might look more like right dominant people, even though they write with their left hand, to people that look kind of opposite of right-handers. So we haven't really dealt with that and trying to figure out the system yet, but yes. I don't take the view that a lot of people take that if you're going to study handedness, you have to do both, and you're expecting this continuum. It's not a continuum. You've got less than 10% of people who are left-handed, and they're very different than the 90% of people that are right-handed. And I don't contest that it's a great idea to study left-handers, but let's figure out what handedness is first, and then go and see how it's expressed in left-handers. That's been my approach. So this kind of brings us back to this idea that left hemisphere specialized for predictable circumstances, and for motor control, we think this is really dealing with dynamic predictions, which a lot of people describe. To get a dynamic prediction, you need something that's called an internal model. We figure that this is really, at least my view on this is that it's really something contained in like a deep neural network if you were to model it, and you're not going to find something that actually explicitly represents inertia and dynamic interactions, but it results in the same thing, the ability to predict dynamic aspects of movement. And then the right hemisphere is specialized for unpredictable circumstances, which really is something like impedance control, which you could think of as modeling as equilibrium point control. So like half of my hypothesis is, consistent with Anatole Feldman and Mark Latash's ideas. Mark jokingly says, oh, we studied the wrong hand, and Anatole unjokingly says, I'm an idiot. So I understand both views, but impedance control, I want to say here, it does involve modulating positional and velocity dependent impedance, but it doesn't mean co-activation. So, I think equilibrium point control is something that's pretty good to look at. You can get equilibrium point control and have reciprocal activation of muscles, even though it's specifying impedance. So, and this is because we have an impedance system that's based on neural circuits in our spinal cord, and we can modulate those in terms of equilibrium point control, motor neuron thresholds, to get effective impedance without having overriding co-activation, although there's also co-activation commands. So recently, Tyler Clough came out with an article that said, oh, we looked at learning dynamics, and Sainburg was right, the right hand did better, but he was wrong, the left hand didn't show co-activation throughout the study. That's not the prediction here. Impedance control does not mean simply you're going to see co-activation. I'm not saying we're not wrong, I'm just saying we're not wrong because of that. So this leads to something that I really want to clarify here. This is a hybrid control model. This means that we don't think the hands are doing this control. We think the hemispheres are, and each hemisphere contributes to each hand. So it just happens that what one hemisphere does has stronger connectivity to the contralateral hand, and so that control will be expressed more in that hand, and vice versa. So our view is a bihemispheric control of each hand, and that's important. And so again, you see Vivek here. We worked on developing a simulation and then optimally fitting it to our data to see if we come up with something that would explain this hybrid control. So we had trajectory torques, what we'll call trajectory torques or optimal torques, and equilibrium torques. This is basically an endpoint equilibrium, it's like the dumb equilibrium point model, as Tamar Flash used to call it, that she used to work with, specify an endpoint and get there. And we use these two sets of torques and we combine them in order to forward integrate a simulated hand path. And so our optimal controller minimized power minimize position error, position at endpoint, and minimize speed error. You want to stop at the endpoint. And so that was a simple objective function. And our impedance controller specified stiffness and viscosity with 0 at the endpoint. And then we used combined control. And the way we combine control is that we started out with completely optimal control, and we ended up with completely impedance control. And we just changed where you switched from one to the other. And we switched rather quickly. So this is an example of it. Here's our simulated paths. We started out with optimal control, but we could switch to impedance control early or late. And you'll see what our paths look like. These are right-hand paths. And so you go from almost completely simulated impedance control, where the dynamics of the limb make you curve, to almost completely straight control, the solution for optimizing relative to the objective function that I showed you. And, in actuality, it turned out that left-hand paths looked more like our impedance control paths, and right-hand paths looked more like our optimal control paths. And so we did this for both multi-joint and single joint movements, and this typically happened where left-hand, our fit was really good between 94 and 100%. And when we fit, our non-dominant arm switched to the impedance controller early in movement, and our dominant arm late in movement, as we kind of expected. The idea that we have these two types of control that are integrated was proposed by other people, including my postdoc mentor, Claude Gaz, and my current collaborator, Bob Scheidt. And so how are these things expressed in bilateral movements? Well, this work was done with Liz Wojtowicz, who is now also in industry, happy and rich. So what we did was we imagined movements like this, where you hold a nail and you hammer, or you cut a loaf of bread, where one arm has to stabilize and deal with the forces imposed by the other arm. And in order to do this, we did something really simple. We just used a spring between the two air slides that I showed you before, so you don't feel haptically the spring. And then we displaced the cursor to a central target position, and you had to hold, there were two cursors. You had to hold one arm's cursor in the target, where you moved to an array of targets with the other arm. So you had the spring load that was variable by direction and imposed by the other hand's movement. So we thought that was a lot like cutting a baguette, if you will. And these are the results. When the left arm had to move, it made a more curvilinear movement dealing with the forces. The right arm made a more straight movement, but the important thing is the left arm stabilized better. And it turns out that the spring force was the same for the right and left arm. So it wasn't that, they were dealing with different forces. The evolution of forces was a little bit different. I'm not going to get into the details, but it turns out that the right arm systematically, regardless of the direction of the movement, moved more. And if we looked at the inverse dynamics, the elbow compliance and the total hand compliance was systematically greater for the right arm, so the inverse of stiffness. So the right arm was just more compliant, which is why it didn't stabilize as well. So we thought this was cool also, because this showed the left arm or the non-dominant arm was actually better at something, stabilizing here. Stabilizing for an evolving force, not a static force.
Can I jump with a question, please?
Absolutely.
So you're actually looking at healthy adults, right? I don't know what age, but it's still adults. So I guess they are training all their lives, if they're right-handed, to hold the bread in the left arm and then cut with the right, or do whatever, stabilize with the left and work with the right.
Absolutely.
So do you think maybe that's why you see this result? And maybe it's not the brain, it's just because they're training all their lives to do this like that.
So if you study motor learning, to say it's not the brain is strange. So it is the brain. And I'll show you how it's the brain later. But does it evolve ontogenetically? Does handedness arise ontogenetically or phylogenetically? And I would argue both. So yes, I think that we are only looking here at adults, and we are only looking here in terms of the brain at adults too. So something tracks the two limbs to function like this, and the tracking of it, at least early on, seems to be affected by phylogenetic or genetic factors. How that evolves and leads to this brain that has these, separation of functions is probably dependent on activity during the lifetime. I agree with that. Is that trivial? No, that's us. That's our brains. That's our adult brains. It'll be really cool to look at how that evolves. So same thing with, there were these, Esther Thielen early on, along with Ron Zernike, was looking at how we learn to control the dynamics of our limbs, and they looked at infants during the first few years of life and demonstrated this evolution of control. So absolutely, I mean, this is not something that's expressed in this way early on. There might be something, some analogs to it, which I expect, but it doesn't, I think that the brain isn't trained by the way that we use our limbs. That being said, the brain is also once you develop, probably through critical periods, the brain is exceedingly resistant to changing when it comes to handedness. So that, as my friends Ben Phillip and Scott Fry have shown, when you have nerve damage or you lose a dominant limb, the non-dominant limb gets better in adulthood. It doesn't get as good as the dominant limb was, but through years it gets better. But interestingly, it does so by recruiting ipsilateral hemisphere. So it doesn't rewrite the differences in the brain. It learns to recruit, both hemispheres or ipsilateral hemisphere more. So it's a great question, and it's one that's kind of unanswerable at this point with the literature that we have, but you can kind of get to it by what's out there. Okay, so is this simply open closed loop control? You can think of a simple, if you look at like equilibrium point control, you can think of it as closed loop because it's dependent on reflexes. And you could think of predictive, control of dynamics as being something that's open loop. And this is something that was hypothesized by a very good colleague of mine. I'll show you work of hers and mine in a little while, Kathy Holland, and also this guy Flowers way back in the 70s. Could that be the case? Well, recently we disentangled these issues by looking at a deafferent patient with a colleague, former postdoc of mine, Fabrice Sarlina. And so the idea here is that we can create a completely open loop situation with proprioceptively deafferent patients. These patients have post-virally lost their large sensory fibers that innervate the sensors that we use predominantly for proprioception, muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and the rapidly adapting skin and soft tissue receptors like the Pacinian corpuscles. When they perform, by the way, I did my postdoc work and my doctoral work in these patients a long time ago, and it was really fun working with Fabrice with this patient who unfortunately GL passed away a few years ago from something unrelated. But so the idea here is when large fiber sensory neuropathy patients perform movements without visual feedback, control is completely open loop. They don't have proprioception. So if you don't show them their movements, everything is open loop. At least theoretically, this is the patient, this is Fabrice, this is the patient's good friend who helped her get around. You can see she's in a wheelchair. She's lost the set of large diameter fibers. This is a soil nerve biopsy, and this is her data, and this is a control, and she's just lost these fibers. I don't want to get into the details of it, but ultimately we don't understand why. And there's been 5 patients in literature described that had this happen to them in the late 80s, early 90s. I was able to work now with 4 of these 5 patients. This is Jeanette just doing a pegboard. She's really unbelievable. She just stuck with it. But what you can see is, she's not moving normally. She looks a lot like an ataxic patient. Not surprising because, the spinocerebellar and dorsal column input is basically obliterated. So to purely feed-forward processes demonstrate lateralization, we never really looked at this. And so this work was done with Shani Jayasinghe, who's now, really brilliant postdoc of mine, who's now in Minnesota, Fabrice Sarlena, maybe some of you know him, and Jake Schaefer, who graduated with his PhD from my lab and now is a master brewer in Philadelphia. Didn't know I prepared people for that, but in some awkward way, I'm proud of that. Anyhow, so this, I'd say this set of data, how you study something and you're basically not convinced with your own, you're wondering how much am I biasing my data because I'm looking for things after a while. This one blew me away. This is what we found. Here are the left-hand paths, here are the right-hand paths. The left hand moved, not so well to the target, but not bad for a diaphragmated patient, and then oscillated with a mean pretty close to the target, like our weak spring with a weak damper. The dominant arm, this is something that's been described a lot before, moved out a little straighter to the target than the left arm did, but then continuously drifted, just couldn't stop. And this was systematic. And so we used a simulation. Bob Scheit was with us on this simulation. He did that work. We used a simulation like the one that I showed you before, where we had this series stiffness controller or predictive controller. And, we pretty much were able to simulate what happened. The diaphragm non-dominant arm used a kind of a poorly controlled stiffness controller, and the diaphragm dominant arm had a really bad stiffness controller and used largely what you could think of as a trajectory or optimal controller. Also not well adapted because you don't have the input to adapt these models. So interestingly, we're not just talking about feedback, feed forward, we're talking about differences in open loop control between the 2 limbs. So if we have this hybrid control, where both hemispheres contribute to each limb, this is the big prediction, then loss of one hemisphere should have an effect on both limbs. And so we used stroke as a model of lesions to test this. And so one of our first studies done with Sydney Schaefer, who's now at ASU, who is a grad student of mine, Kathy Holland, who's a neuropsychologist who taught me so much in terms of neuropsychology assessments and dealing with stroke patients in a quantitative way, including lesion characterization. We work together on these projects, and this is an overlap analysis of right hemisphere and left hemisphere damaged patients reaching to 3 directions. And essentially what we found is, these are just sample movements here, but here's a systematic analysis across subjects. We found that the left hemisphere damaged patients with their good arm, this is the important thing, their good arm, made less straight movements but got to the targets fairly well, and right hemisphere damaged patients made straighter movements but got to the target poorly. Here you see overshot, but if you look over here, what we did was we quantified the variance at the beginning and end of the movement. Right hemisphere damaged patients at peak velocity had lower variance than they had at the end of their movement. They had trouble stopping. Left hemisphere damaged patients at the end of their movement had lower variance than they did at the beginning of their movement. So they had problems starting, but not so much stopping. And this was systematic across patients. So this was with their good arms. So this was kind of amazing to us. This is the very early data that we might not be totally wrong. And being able to predict something in stroke patients is tough enough, but with their good arm, differences, we were pretty impressed by our own data there. So what parts of the brain are specialized for these different aspects of control? So we're going to separate the brain into 4 parts: the front, the back, the right, and the left. And what we were able to do, thanks to Kathy Holland, was, I'm sorry, I'll show you in a minute. We were able to get patients with focal lesions, and I'll show you how focal. It was pretty impressive. Not a lot of patients, but we were able to look at both hands then in these patients. And so what we did was we looked at visual motor adaptations, and this is where the cursor moves in a different direction in the hand. We moved in very many different directions, and as we did this, as you do this task, you eventually get to the point where you move in the right direction in order to get the cursor. So you're moving off in order to get the cursor to the target nice and straight. A lot of people in this field are familiar with this. It continues to be a paradigm that's studied extensively. It's thought to be sort of an analog of motor learning, this motor adaptation paradigm. People are arguing over what's implicit and what's explicit in this, about what's slow and fast learning. But that has very little relevance to what we're studying here. By the way, I just had Pratik Mutta, a previous student of mine, who's been very much involved in this argument. And a lot of the labs that are looking at implicit and explicit are reducing the number of targets. If you do this task, what you'll find is when you do lots and lots of directions, then it's very difficult to adapt using explicit strategy. And so I think for the most part, what we're studying is largely implicit. I don't think it really matters for this, but just to let you know. So these are the focal lesions. This is kind of amazing. We had 5 in each group, 5 patients in each group. I think more non-human primate studies, to get these very specific lesions is almost impossible. And so Kathy Holland was able to sort out her data. We were able to find these 5 patients in each group that had either right parietal damage with a concentration of damage around the interparietal sulcus, right frontal damage with the concentration of damage around dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and analogous lesions in the same areas in the left side. It was the most amazing thing to be able to get these patients with these specific lesions. And so when we looked at this adaptation, here final position error, and here trajectory error is curvature in the trajectory. And what we got was, we also in another study used initial direction error. It doesn't really matter because the trajectory error comes when you move in the wrong direction, then you correct for it. So right frontal damage, excuse me, I have to move something. What we found was that the stroke patients showed worse ability to correct back to the target with right frontal damage, but right pyramidal damage, they look just like controls. And they had what we call the trajectory advantage here. In other words, what they were doing was they weren't correcting well back to the target, which is why they showed this error during the course of learning. They eventually converged, not totally converged in terms of their straightness of movement. And then the right parietal damage, right parietal damage, they look just like controls. All right, so then we look at that left side. Left frontal damage looked just like controls. Left parietal damage, they had this trajectory, but they actually moved back to the target early and better than controls did. So why didn't controls achieve the target? We only gave people a certain amount of time to move, and we only looked at where they moved to when they initially stopped. So of course, if we keep giving them the ability to correct back to the target, they'll do it. But this is looking at the initial segment of their movement to the point where they got to 8%, where they made a minima below 8% of their initial peak velocity. So what we got was this double dissociation. Right hemisphere frontal damage, gave us positional deficits, final position deficits, ability to stop, and left hemisphere parietal damage gave us trajectory deficits, ability to start out correctly. So if lesions prevent learning, can stimulation improve learning and transfer? So this is something that we're in the middle of right now. And what we did was, for various reasons that for time I don't really want to get into here, we used HD TDCS, and we stimulated at baseline and early in adaptation. We looked at interlimb transfer, and we looked at readaptation. And what we got, this is our early findings, corrected the baseline. Adaptation in terms of early direction looked exactly the same as oh, I'm not showing it here. I haven't updated this, I'm sorry. Early adaptation looked exactly the same in right stimulation and in sham in terms of adaptation. But then interlimb transfer was substantially, statistically significantly better for our stimulation group when we stimulated the left side, but not the right side. Interestingly, our final position error got worse in terms of transfer. So I'm sorry, I didn't update this where we have our right stimulation group. So this was kind of cool because it's verifying our lesion findings. So we think that lateralization trajectory and steady state position reflected left and right hemisphere processing. Kind of going fast here. What are the clinical implications for stroke? Well, we realized that patients had deficits in their good arm. And so Candy Menza, Kelly Winstein, and these guys here, we did a initial intervention study trying to get the good hand better in stroke. We segmented people by the severity of their impairment. I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you first what happened when we looked at 120 stroke patients, good hand on clinical tasks. So this is the Jebsen-Taylor hand function test, a bunch of ADL-like things. We timed them. And the the unaffected arm did really bad, worse when it was left hemisphere damage, left arm, but still really bad when it was right hemisphere damage, right arm. So when you have unilateral damage, your ipsilateral arm has functional deficits, not just kinematic deficits. And these functional deficits get worse with the degree of paretic arm damage. So this is the worst case scenario. When you can't do anything with your paretic arm, you have the worst deficits in your non-paretic arm. So recognizing this, I'm going to skip this. Recognizing this, we tried to do something about it. We addressed the deficits in our little, poor man's VR system here, or, planar VR system. And then we did real life training and a whole bunch of kind of occupational therapy tasks. And we did an initial training period for 3 weeks, and then a sham, and then a retention period in our initial study. This was just with a few stroke survivors. The reason we have a sham experience, which is we were going to have a crossover study, but COVID happened. But essentially what we got was we could get the non-paretic arm functioning 20% better, and that hung out for about 6 weeks, 3 weeks after our sham experience. The functional dependence measure, which is a patient self-report, how much better can you do everyday things for yourself? That got better. That's usually really resistant to intervention. And interestingly, the paretic arm function got better, but not really the function. The Fugelmeyer, we think they were just doing more in their daily activities. So this was really exciting. And so we did we are now in the middle of a large scale study where we have a better control, where we're doing more patients, which got screwed up by COVID, but we can't get as many patients as we thought we would, but we're still getting a bunch. Kelly Winstein, who's done a lot of intervention studies in stroke, and me are working together on this. We're in our last year of the intervention study. We have a big training period, which is 5 weeks, 3 times a week. We're either doing ipsilesional arm training or contralesional arm training. And so our control group is contralesional arm training. Why? You have severe paresis. We believe that contralesional arm training is going to get that arm better, but that's not going to translate very much to function. And we believe ipsilesional arm training is. We're only functioning on people with severe paresis. So that's our study right now. These people, unfortunately, you don't know them, but David Gator is a really great scientist, and David Wagstaff, who was our statistician, passed away in the middle of the study, which is really sad. So our approach is test and remediate both limbs, especially if you have severe paresis. It's not really the wrong arm. One more thing. Well, we're also thinking about doing something based on all this garbage that I just showed you. Something that I've been floored by is when people lose a dominant arm due to the loss, partial loss of limb or due to nerve damage. In rehab, we're not doing dominance retraining, and that's something we really should be doing. So here's the funding sources. I guess I don't have the people. All right, I showed you a picture of a bunch of people all along. I'm sorry, but thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions. Sorry I went so long. Anybody? Did I go too fast?
Can I ask a question? Yes. Hey, first, I love your studies, and I think the findings are very interesting. If I understand correctly, all of the findings and the interpretations are focused on the two hemispheres from the cortex. And I wonder what's your perspective on the role of the cerebellum and basal ganglia in this motor control story. For example, what could be a unique role of these subcortical structures compared to the two hemispheres from the cortex?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe. I'm not quite sure about the basal ganglia, but it's, there have been studies that have shown at least structural asymmetries in the cerebellum and some functional asymmetries. It's hard to believe that this type of differences in control that are probably genetically predetermined to some extent, but, get tracked through the lifetime of different use. It's hard to believe that they're not in training or possibly entrained by the other systems that are that are thought to be kind of in a model hierarchically, lower than them. And it's also hard to believe that the spinal cord isn't entrained also. And, my friend Jack Martin has shown that cortical activity very early in development, in at least kittens, entrains the structural differences in the spinal cord, not left-right, but that occur from anterior to posterior in the spinal cord. And it's hard to believe the same thing doesn't happen through other critical periods with left-right. But, there's no, the same thing. These are functional distinctions. And I think that we're just really discovering functional distinctions in the nervous system. Structurally, you don't see that much. It's there, volume-wise, you see asymmetries and all. But the structural asymmetries, people have explained away by this global dominance perspective. One hemisphere is better than the other. I don't think that that's really the way that neuropsychologists, cognitive psychologists, and us see lateralization. We see it as a distribution of function, not a good and a bad hemisphere. So the structural differences are there. They probably will pan out in terms of functional differences. Our view, by the way, we're doing a lot with motor learning. We've done it all the way through. I just showed you a little bit, but our view is a little different than other people's views. We picture the cortex as being the place where you do a lot of the sort of higher level modeling and storage. And we picture the cerebellum as the place where you assess errors and send that information. I mean, we know that the cerebellum assesses errors, and those errors are, based to some degree on sensory predictions. We think the sensory predictions are coming through the climbing fibers, and that's the thing that's done in the cortex. So this is in contrast with great people like Amy Bastian and John Krakauer and Pablo Selnick, who think that pretty much everything's done in the cerebellum, including storage. I just don't think that, and I think our data speak to that.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Sure. Any other questions?
At the end, you said something very briefly about dominance retraining. I haven't heard of this before, so good.
Yeah, you haven't heard of it, which I think is amazing. So I was first trained as an OT, and in OT school, this used to be a bachelor's degree in the States, OT and PT, when back in the Middle Ages when I got my bachelor's degree, and we were taught about dominance and all, and how important it was to function and everything. We weren't taught. Nobody knew about the neural substrate to dominance really, but we were taught to assess it. And I always made the assumption that when people lost a dominant arm, OTs retrained the non-dominant arm to become dominant. And I was really shocked when I did a search to find that nobody retrains the non-dominant arm to become dominant. And like I said before, we're really resistant to switching dominance. Now, there are examples of people, my mother was one of them, who, due to either religious training or just schooling in public schools, in different places in the world, including the US, but in the early 20th century, people were kind of discouraged if they were left-handed from using their left hand and encouraged to write with their right hand. And when I say discouraged or encouraged, this wasn't done by reinforcement training. And my mom wrote with her right hand, even though she was naturally left-handed, but she really grew up doing a bunch of things with her non-natural, dominant hand or right hand, and doing them really poorly and sloppily. And the things that she wasn't forced to do, she would do with her left hand. And so I think that we're pretty resistant. I think we have a genetic predisposition to some-handedness, and we're pretty resistant to change. And I think it's because of the lateralization of our nervous system. And so, as I said, Ben Phillip and Scott Fry have shown this, and have shown that when you do retrain, if you lose, your radial digits, or if you have mangled hand, which is a horrible syndrome that you get from damaging your hand, just what it sounds like, or you get peripheral nerve damage, turns out, contrary to what I learned in neurobiology school, if you have peripheral nerve damage, you regain full function in single percentage cases. I mean, you usually have deficits. And so the thing is, if your dominant arm gets knocked out for any of these reasons, you have to function with your non-dominant arm. And really, you should switch handedness. And I think in rehabilitation, it's just assumed, heck, you're just going to be using that hand, you'll get better. And I think that's a faulty assumption. I think you actually have to retrain the hand. And I think when you're retraining the hand based on the literature that we have, what you're really doing is learning to access the ipsilateral hemisphere rather than rewriting the contralateral hemisphere. And so I'm really interested in working on a dominance retraining intervention, and I think we're going to start something like that, at least potentially trying to get funding for it soon. I remember once talking a long time ago, we started doing this stuff. I talked to Neville Hogan about this, and he's developed prosthetics earlier in his career. And Neville said he was really excited about our differentiation because he was trying to develop an impedance controlled prosthetic for the hand that lost function, that lost radial digit to the whole hand. And the idea, his intuitive idea, was that what the non-dominant arm does is really impedance control. Anything else?
Okay. This is just an out there question. Do you have a reason why the left and right hemispheres have these particular roles? It's something to do with like the structure of the neural networks or something like this? Or?
I mean, it's early on. We don't really know networks. I think with the stimulation work we're doing, we're planning to eke out like the posterior parietal to frontal network, which my colleague and his co-workers, Gene Tunick, have done for reaching and grasping to some extent using TMS. Why? I mean, the big picture why, I just think that these are functions that are lateralized, like I said before, because it would be ridiculous to repeat those functions in each hemisphere. You can get more neurons for each function. There's no reason to cross the hemispheres for the internal dynamics of the circuits. But you know, whenever we see something lateralized like language, the intrahemispheric connections are the same in analogous regions. So the posterior temporal lobe, you know, stores and processes meaning and syntax to words in most people's left hemisphere, but then prosody and nonverbal communication is the same regions in the right hemisphere. And you know, people that study language get mad when I simplify it like this, but we all get mad when people not in our field simplify things. But that's basically the scheme. And it's not that the right hemisphere is non-dominant, you know, for language, because if you lose those non-verbal aspects of language, you lose a lot of meaning and function. And actually, artificial intelligence still has problems with that aspect of language. So it's not like it's computationally simpler. I think that this distribution of function just happened. It could have happened a different way. It could have been left, right. Maybe it could have been two regions in one hemisphere, but I doubt it. But you know, why separate these functions? I don't know. There's some data to suggest that when you separate functions in each hemisphere, they don't interfere with each other so much. That would be part of it, because they are somewhat competitive. Impedance at endpoint versus trajectory, you could think of. I also have toyed with what's the evolutionary advantage, and I actually don't know if it's so much coordination and control and learning as it is cognitive. So if we have these two functions, like as opposed to language and cognition, this lateralization is expressed in behavior. You know, language is all integrated into our language. Why would it be advantageous to have the two hands doing two different things through evolution? Actually, work from us, but before this, David Rosenbaum and other people has shown that, you know, when you do like a reaction time paradigm, you do a forced reaction time, which is, you know, you have some choices, say target direction or target distance or whatever it is. And then boom, you're given one of the choices. The number of things you have to select, like the number of choices you have, determines your reaction time. Or in other words, the more complex the problem that you have, the longer you take to plan. You know, that's kind of obvious, but it was shown really nicely by these guys. The thing with David Rosenbaum's work and our work looking at reaction time, when you have to choose hand, that really extends your reaction time. So we're talking about hundreds of milliseconds to choose a hand. Well, that seems nuts, you know. That's a really, really long time in motor control, you know, and functional terms. So what I think, and I've done nothing with this other than a recent article suggested, but maybe if our two hands are doing different things, because I think the big question is, our two hemispheres do two different things. Why can't each hand take advantage of both hemispheres and be symmetric? And I think the fact is, or the fact, I'm sorry to say it that way, you know, our arms aren't symmetric, and maybe that asymmetry confers advantages in terms of arm selection. So if we could just switch hands at will, maybe that would give us a huge disadvantage functionally, because we'd have to always make this choice which hand to use. So that's one idea. And the other idea is that maybe it just confers advantages to lifetime experience for that function. So we always train, you know, the sensory motor circuits in one hand one way and the other way. I don't know. You know, that's the one that's really bothered me, is these other lateralized systems, we can access both hemispheres really well. But with the motor system, the right and the left hands don't access both hemispheres the same.
Right.
So, and you know, we're probably wrong. I mean, these are just the two things that come out in our studies. I think it is two things, but I don't know if it's these, I think we can say it's these two things because of our studies, but I don't know what it is.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
do we have time for?
Think about that. Yeah. Sorry, Mika, go ahead.
Yeah. Do we have time for a small question?
I do.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, thank you for the lecture. I have so many thoughts in my mind. So you were talking, you went really quickly with the the clinical implication studies, and I just want to know that I got it right. Are you saying that if we train the unaffected arm because of the bilateralization of the hemisphere, we can actually affect the affected hemisphere?
No, I think that if we train, so there's so much controversy in the literature about this, and especially when you get into stimulation paradigms. So I think the idea of interhemispheric inhibition has kind of been blown up, and people think that. So there's two perspectives on this. People think that. So I can't think of her name. Sorry, but there's this one model that oh my goodness, if we train up the good hemisphere, the unaffected hemisphere, then it's going to have more inhibition of the affected hemisphere, and our good limb won't do as our bad limb won't do as well. And then there's kind of a different perspective, which comes from the Jules de Wald perspective, which is our good hemisphere actually gets recruited by our bad hemisphere in order to activate subcortical systems like the reticulospinal system, which gives us abnormal synergies. And so from his perspective, let's use the bad limb in the bad hemisphere more, and let's try to not let the bad limb hemisphere take over the good limb hemisphere system. So they're kind of opposite. So from his perspective, it would be good to use the good hemisphere as much as possible for the good hand and try and stop using it for the bad hand. I know this gets crazy. I'm using good and bad because it makes it a little better.
Mm-hmm.
You have these two kind of competing views, and I'm not addressing either of them, actually. I'm saying more functionally, we have a good hemisphere and a good limb, and the good hemisphere is actually not so good.
Mm-hmm.
When we have severe paresis, and I'm an OT, so this is painful to say, but it's true. When we have severe paresis, no matter what we get with the bad limb, it's not going to be functional. So, you're never going to get functional grasp and release in a limb that's severely paretic. You can get better movement in it, which is really good because that helps with putting on your shirt and, it makes you more comfortable, and that's good. But what we have oftentimes, not all the time, is when you have low, moderate to severe paresis, you've got pretty bad coordination in the good arm. And what I'm saying is those patients then have problems doing ADLs. And it's not because of their bad arm, it's because of their deficits in their good arm. And what's not done in rehab is that people don't recognize the good arm as having deficits. Now, if you were an OT and I sent a person or a child especially to you, and they had coordination deficits in their arms, like we're seeing for the good arm, the OT would be like, oh my God, you have developmental coordination disorder, I can treat you. But when they see a stroke patient, they say, the good arm looks so much better than the bad arm, just use it. And what I'm saying is, no, there's coordination deficits, and all we have to do is focus on them for a few weeks, and you can get substantially better in your ADLs. The fact that the good arm in our study the bad arm got a little better, I attribute to nothing. when people read our papers and they come to our posters and they say that's interlimb transfer. And I said, no, I really doubt it. I think what it is our patients are reporting. So for example, in our preliminary study that I showed you, one of our patients, we always said, can you do anything more at the end? And this patient was there with his wife, and his wife kind of went, yes, I don't have to go in the bathroom with him in the morning. So that 20% better changed this guy's life because he got more coordinated. So he wasn't dropping things, and he was able to do toileting by himself. So that matters. The fact also is that he was doing more, and I think that's why we saw like a 2 to 5 improvement in the Fugl-Meyer in the bad side. Is that functionally significant? Is that clinically significant? No. Was it,
is that a
statistically
start?
significant?
Is that a start though?
Maybe. I think it's just that they were doing more. And whenever you do more, then you're probably going to have a better state in your whole system. And so you're going to look better over there when you're tested with the Fugl-Meyer. So yeah, I mean, I don't think the goal of rehab is to get the bad arm better, the good arm better, the blah, blah better. I think it's to get the patient functioning better. And so I'm just advocating that we recognize that there are deficits in the good arm sometimes. Test them. And if there are significant deficits, then treat them. That's all. But I don't know. We'll see what happens with our bigger intervention study. For all I know, we got no effects, and then I'll be saying something different.
Yeah.
We'll know in 2 years.
I hope so, because from what we've been seeing, and I have experience with treating persons post-stroke, is that the overactivity of the good limb. I'm using good because it's easier. The overactivity of the good limb, it seems like the good limb wants to be the dominant and the non-dominant hand at the same time. So if you're talking about shifting handedness, so maybe teaching the good arm to be the dominant one in order for them to function more, we need to also teach the bad arm to be the non-dominant one. And
I think that would make a lot of sense.
It's not black and white, it has to be, the answer has to be learning, motor learning of the good arm and the bad arm, so that the person would be functioning. And also when we think about long-term, then the long-term deficits that they have in the bad arm, so they have their ADL for the first 2 years, but then because of the overactivity of the good arm, they start having carpal tunnel syndrome, neuropathies. Sometimes the overactivity makes the good arm not so good in the long run. So I think that the answer should be both, and it needs to be every case on its own. So
no, that's a good point, and I think what we want to advocate is testing both. And the idea of training the bad arm to be an impedance controller, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's probably better at that anyhow, once it's been damaged. And, there's absolutely no doubt that bilateral training is critical in recovery. We're not doing it in our intervention. This intervention is an experimental intervention to find out proof of concept. But real intervention, of course, and has always, I was trained back in the early 80s to be an OT. And of course, bilateral training, people recognize that bilateral training is critical to recovery of function.
Yeah. Thank you.
But I don't think bilateral training is the way to go with trying to get each limb better in rehab. I think that you need to really focus. My friend and colleague Carolee Winstein published a few papers where she showed that bilateral training didn't challenge the good limb enough, and so it's not going to get better by bilateral training. Obviously, depending on the training. But the way that she did it, which is this thing like Jill Whitall has done, where the two limbs are trying to cooperate to do the same thing, which actually isn't functional bilateral training. Functional bilateral training would be more like our spring task, where the bad limb might be being trained to stabilize rather than do the same thing the other limb is doing. So I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was
All right.
fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Vika. Thanks a lot, Bob. That was really a great talk. I learned a lot today. And yeah.
Thank you. And I'd be happy to stay in touch through email.
Okay, yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.